You say that. Okay, thanks. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program here at Columbia University. We have a speaker today who is a special friend of the program because he was a postdoc in the program, and I'll introduce him more fully. Please come to our meetings either in person here in IAB 918 on the Columbia campus or virtually. And if you want to know which events are coming up, you can always visit the China and the World website at Columbia University. And Daniel Sahansky, the associate director of the program, will inform you how to get informed about our programming. Like I said, we have a special speaker today, a longtime colleague in the program. He was a fellow way back when at Princeton University before the program moved to Columbia. He is Todd Hall. He is a professor at the University of Oxford, and he is currently the director of the China Center at the University of Oxford, which makes me say, you know, I knew him way back when, and now he's a star. Really proud of Todd and his performance since he finished the fellowship. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2008, and he had the postdoctoral fellowship with us. He had one at Harvard. He's been a visiting scholar at the Free University of Berlin, at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and the University of Tokyo. Before he became a professor at Oxford, he was an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And he's published everywhere that matters in international relations and international security. International Organization, International Security, International Studies Quarterly, International Studies Review, Political Science Quarterly, Security Studies, Political Psychology. And he's an expert on international relations theory, and our program is designed to try to meld China studies with social science. And Todd Hall is a great example of what we're trying to do and promote. He's a real expert in IR theory, and he's particularly an expert on the role of emotion in international politics, an understudied topic. And he recently published a book called Emotional Diplomacy, Official Emotion on the International Stage, which won a very fancy award, the co-winner of the International Studies Association Diplomatic Studies Section Book Award for 2016. So it's with tremendous pleasure that I introduce you to Todd. In addition to everything I said about him, he's a really nice guy, and we really like to have him back. So I will sit down. So please welcome Todd Hall.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I shall try to do my best to live up to that. So what I'm going to present today is something I'm working on with Andrea Ghiselli of Fudan University, and it came out of a series of conversations we had. It's evolved a bit over that period as well, but it came out of basically the observation that we're getting. I mean, I think probably many of you will find this as well. The space that's China and international relations is being flooded with literature now. I mean, there's just massive amounts out there, and you can hardly keep up with it in some ways. But the interesting thing is it seemed to us that instead of reaching a consensus, that we were somehow moving towards some agreement on making sense of the People's Republic of China and international relations, we're actually getting a whole bunch of very disparate views that came to very different conclusions. And in some cases, these conclusions, or these scholars who were involved in reaching these conclusions, didn't even seem to be talking to each other. And of course, I mean, I'm thinking of things like, you know, on the one hand, you have the Hamarian-Jones Fractured China, which tells the story of this very sort of disorganized, bureaucratic mess that has evolved because of the pressures of globalization and the ways in which the Chinese state has evolved. On the other hand, you have people like Rush Doshi who tell a story of the PRC is very unified and has this long game and has this plan for overtaking the United States, or also those who just tell very sort of larger structural stories about, you don't even, you know, it's not about China per se, it's just about great powers and such. And so we're trying to make sense of, well, how do you make sense of how people are making sense of the PRC's role in the world and its foreign policy? And what we settled upon, I mean, the conclusion we came to was there's really sort of two key questions we thought served a did a good job of acting as sorting mechanisms. And so the first question is, do scholars think the PRC is distinctive? Do scholars think the PRC is something unique, sui generis, something that has its own attributes, etc.? The other question is the PRC unified? Do you see the PRC as a unitary actor, or do you see it as somehow disorganized, as something in which domestic politics play a great role? And the reason and you could ask a lot of questions, right? You could use a lot of questions as sorting mechanisms. Why these two questions? We think that these are sort of fundamental questions that form the basis for other questions you might ask. Because if you answer one of these questions differently, it sets you on a very different path for the subsequent questions you may ask about how do you understand the behavior of the people, the PRC. So what emerges from this is one of those almost cliched devices within international relations theory, the 2x2. And it's those of us, especially those of us who studied 80s and 90s era international relations. This is a bit of a throwback. But what we come out of this is you, in fact, if you look at how people might answer these questions, in the upper right corner, those who see both a unitary and distinctive PRC, you have what we call the exceptionalists. I'll go into each of these categories separately. In the upper left-hand corner, excuse me, in the upper right-hand corner, you have those who see the PRC as unitary, but not necessarily distinctive, and those we call the Universalists. Then you have those who see the PRC as not unitary and very distinctive, or even just don't put it into conversation with other things, and those are the Particularists. And then you have those who try to bring it into conversation with other theories of foreign policy or domestic politics, and those we call the Comparativists. And each of these has their own, they have their own sort of, how should I say, ways of making sense of the world. And so I'm going to go through where I think some of it. Now, to be very clear, we make these in the illustration, and this is for illustrative purposes. What we have is, clear blocks. But there are people sometimes who border on one or two, who sort of span a little. Those are I think, getting rarer. But so there are ways in which you can be, between the Particularists and the Comparativists, or between the Exceptionalists and the Particularists, et cetera. But to give sort of the ideal types, I'm going to use a few examples. So the Exceptionalists. The Exceptionalists are those who argue that there's something that makes the PRC a power unseen like anything in history. So they see the PRC as something that's special, that's different, that defies our previous understandings. And the Exceptionalists have usually, we find, take two forms, although there's probably others. First, and I'd say Xi Jinping is a bit of an exceptionalist. He says, he has this line, the love for, and this is a direct quote, the love for peace is in the DNA of the Chinese people, right? The Chinese people are somehow different. The story of, the Chinese are peace-loving. They're not like Western powers. And this is the PRC as a civilizational power narrative. There's something about cynic civilization, cultural values and beliefs, or past historical experience that makes the PRC different. These are the ones who say, well, you can't just go applying Western theories of international relations to the People's Republic of China, because the People's Republic of China isn't just any European power and a European power system. It's something different. It had a very different experience. You see this, for example, in those who point to the tributary system and say the history of the tributary system is something that gives the PRC a very different basis for international relations, one that's based on understanding of hierarchy as opposed to anarchy, one that's based on understanding of peace and reciprocity as opposed to constant war. And you see this, and that's probably a slight characterization of David Kong's argument, but there is elements of that in David Kong's argument. But you also see this in some of the, what I'd call, regime adjacent scholarship you see in the PRC too, the ones who say that the PRC is a moral power, that the PRC is not, the US is botching. The US is this hegemon, right? And it's out to, it uses power in a capricious way, whereas we're Wanged out. We're not like the US. We have a moral purpose to our power. We see, we're part of the developing world. We see something more in what international relations can be. And that's why we're also promoting things like, these shared community of fate, all these things that the PRC promotes, because there is this moral purpose, and we're not like other Western powers. And so you see this both within and without China. outside of China in scholarship. But there is another version of this. And this is one that you see more outside of China. And this is the techno-authoritarian superpower version, that the PRC has somehow mastered the formula for economic and technological development, surveillance, and oppression. So yes, there were other powers that were authoritarian in the past, but somehow the PRC, because of its use of technology, its use of control, its use of ideology, that it's somehow done something that other powers couldn't. And this makes the PRC much different. It's figured out the plans, and we have to pay attention to the plans. And it's very interesting to see those, for example, who previously would say that, we can't have state planning because state planning is a disaster, are the same people who now say, well, you have to look at this plan that the PRC has as if it's exactly going to go to plan, right? And this belief that, state planning works in the PRC, that they're somehow have mastered the bureaucracy or the technocratic expertise that makes them different, makes the PRC different from existing powers. And, sorry, excuse me. Then, in comparison to them, you have the Universalists. So whereas the Exceptionalists say the PRC is unique and different, the Universalists say, yes, the PRC is a unified power. Yes, it has certain, we don't have to look in the domestic politics of the PRC to figure out what the most important elements affecting PRC foreign policy and activity within international relations are, but it doesn't act any different from any other power. And these, for example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, right? So he says, if you want to understand how rising powers behave and how the interaction between rising powers and existing hegemons unfold, you need to look at history. And he says, if you look at history, out of the 16 powers that 16 instances that you had rising powers, of those 13 ended up in war. And of course, here there's an understanding of sort of a cyclical notion of history, or a way in which there's patterns that repeat. That if you can uncover those patterns, those patterns will have structural effects that will apply across all cases that match the criteria of those patterns. And this is the story that Graham Allison tells. It's certainly made quite a lot of, I should say, it's something that has certainly been picked up in quite a few policy circles. But there's also another version of this. And that's not rising powers and hegemons. That's not necessarily what Mearsheimer is focusing on. He's focusing more on how do great powers behave and how do they seek security. And so if you've heard Mearsheimer speak, I'm sure many of you have heard him tell this story, sort of this, PRC is not any different than the United States. When the United States was rising, it tried to control its region because that's what rising powers do to try and become secure. And so you seek domination of your region, you expect all any other powers. The United States did that. It had the Mexican War, it had the Spanish-American War. It had a very violent rise in its region, and it pushed other powers out. And then it started offshore balancing with other peer competitors to make sure nobody could interfere with its region. Now the PRC is going to do the same thing. As what's good for the goose is good for the gander, that the United States did it. Well, why would the PRC behave any differently? It wants to have security. It wants to dominate its region. And because it wants to dominate its region, it's going to come into conflict with the United States that wants to prevent peer competitors from rising. And it's just how great powers work. That's the tragedy of great power politics. And this is this notion that there's these structural factors that affect behavior. And of course, it's no different for any great power. Contrast that with the particularists, excuse me. If you want to understand PRC foreign policy, you have to understand its inner workings. You have to look inside. The PRC, you want to know what's going on, you have to open the black box. And so you have to look inside the system. So this is a chart of PRC foreign policy making. I took from a book by $1. I had to replace it because, of course, at the time he wrote it was the medium small group, not the Foreign Affairs Work Commission. But the way in which you understand the PRC is you just look at how it serves. You have the standing committee and the Politburo at the top. You have the central Foreign Affairs Work Commission and Work Committee. Then you have underneath that, you have the state, you have the party, you have the military, Central Military Commission, and under that you have the various ministries. You have the various elements of the party. including, the United Front work, all these things. And you look at that system, you understand the bureaucratic system, you understand how, you need to look at that system to understand how it works. Because if you don't understand how these different things interact, and of course, people would say that the party actually permeates all of this, and there's questions about party and state, but those are all questions that are about opening that black box and understanding how do things work, how are things put together, when something happens, who has the authority, why did it happen in that way? And of course, it's not just the PRC system. People like David Lambton have argued you have to look at the leaders, the personality profiles, the leadership styles of the central leader, or, and this gets to, what's Xi Jinping's personality vis-a-vis Jiang Zemin, this Hu Jintao, with Xi Jinping, of course, being a very different actor, and you have to understand Xi Jinping thought and how that's different than, Jiang Zemin and how he viewed the world, and by understanding, or understanding, I mean, some people come back a little and say, well, you have to understand the dynamics of the top leadership. But of course, there's a lot of focus right now on Xi Jinping and what Xi Jinping thought is, and how you can understand how Xi Jinping views the world. And if you understand how Xi Jinping views the world, then you can understand Chinese foreign policy. And that's not a matter of theorizing broadly, it's a matter of looking really closely at specific actors, trying to make sense, what is their background, what is their understanding of the world, what are they saying, etc. Now, the last one are the comparativists. And they say the inner workings are also key, but we can still take theories and other things, and we should be taking theories from other parts of social sciences, other parts of comparative politics, other areas, to make sense of how the PRC behaves. And these involve, for example, authoritarian legitimacy. So if you have an authoritarian power, they have to legitimate themselves in certain ways. They have a selectorate, they have a certain group that interacts to maintain the leadership and power. If you want to understand how the PRC foreign policy works, you have to understand those dynamics. I think you see that, for example, in Jessica Weeks and authoritarian audience costs. You also see that, in certain logics of governance being shared across regimes, certain understanding of bureaucratic politics. I would argue Susan Shirk's recent work in some ways falls into this category as well. I don't know how many of you are familiar with her latest book, Overreach, but she sort of argues that in some ways, during the Hu Jintao era, you're seeing what Jack Snyder called log rolling. And so you had this group that basically under Hu Jintao had a weak center. So you had all these various actors. I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. So you want to pursue this hawkish policy and get more money and get more resources and build whatever, build your aircraft carriers. Okay, we'll let you do that, but you look the other way when we do this. And therefore you get this authoritarian overreach. And then under Xi Jinping, you have a situation of authoritarian overconcentration. And that's like many regimes when the center becomes too strong, people become afraid to say certain things to the center, and she argues that you're not getting the information flows that need to be corrective, and therefore you're getting overreach first because of a weak center, then secondly because of an overly strong center. And those are theories that could apply to any sort of situation where you have those dynamics. It's not necessarily that that's anything special to China. In fact, her drawing on Jack Snyder is evidence of that, because Jack Snyder was looking at Japanese imperial expansion and German imperial expansion. And so this is a story that says, comparativist theories apply to China, and that's how we should make sense of the world. Now, I will be honest with you. Well, first of all, one final thing before I start being honest. I do think, I'll lie to you some more. I do think this is not just academic, right? Because how you understand, how you make sense of this also tells you how you then make sense of things that are arising right now. It's very interesting, all the different ways people made sense of the wandering balloon incident, and the idea that, is this something that was a plan? Is this a plot? Is it internal politics? Is it an intentional provocation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Because how you make sense of what happens depends on how you make sense of the PRC, because that theory then informs how you make sense of new things that occur. That theory also informs how you tell stories about the broader trajectory of PRC behavior. And so this is not just something that's purely academic. It does inform what you think you're interacting with, and also what then matters or doesn't matter, what will make a difference, won't make a difference, what will have effects, doesn't have effects in interaction with PRC as well. Now, I will be honest. Now I'm going to be honest. Get the microphone there. I will be honest. When I started this, I was very much leaning towards being a comparativist. But my views have evolved over the course of the project. And so, but the question is first of all, why do we have these differences, right? I think one simple, easy answer is you could say, well, worldview. Realists see the world differently than liberals, than, for example, people who focus on comparative politics. If you have a certain understanding of the world, if you have a certain theory of the world, of course, you're going to have different ways you explain the world, right? And so to use the social science language, if your basic ontology is different, you're not going to see the world in the same way. Second, I think is very important is language and interlocutors. Different people use different sources. They have different interlocutors. Given those different interlocutors, they also get different stories. And if you have the language skills sometimes, you can see a lot more going on. The PRC system, I think, produces massive amounts of commentary on itself. And that is available. It's becoming less available, but it is still available. It's still out there. But you need the language skills to be able to access it. And if you're only using a few selected sources that everybody's using, if you're using the whatever it is, military manual, the one manual that got, or the one book that got translated from 1999 to say this is how Chinese foreign policy works or Chinese military policy works, you're going to have a very different view if you're really deep in the sources. And the same thing is true with interlocutors. And you have very different interactions and very different stories depending on your interlocutors. And also methodology. Methodology does change how you approach this. If you're doing large-scale statistical surveys, drawing data from multiple countries, well, you're obviously going to be pulled much more in a comparativist angle. And so these are, of course, basic differences. But that's not the most interesting thing, I think. And this gets to how I've moved beyond just thinking that one box is right. And what if we said these are not just basic assumptions? Because usually what we say, okay, is you have your theory, and your theory is based on certain assumptions, and as long as the assumptions hold, your theory flows from that. But what if we don't treat these as assumptions, but instead say that they're actually empirical claims that vary? And I think the axes of variance are actually quite clear and quite important. And so if we say that the unitary claim and the distinctiveness claim actually are things that vary depending upon context, we get a much different story. And it also highlights the fact, let's be honest, the exceptionalists, in some cases, I think they do have a case to make. There are certain elements of the PRC system that are PRC-ish. You see certain types of PRC politics, for example, or the particularists, particularly, that things like Xi Jinping does matter. Things like the way in which the PRC conducts policy, the sort of campaign-style politics that used to exist within the PRC that now seems to be spilling out or not even being pushed out onto the international stage. That is, there are certain ways the PRC does things that are the product of the PRC's history and political system. But the exceptionalists have some cases, or the particularists have a case, but the universalists also have a case, and the fact that structural factors do matter, and structural factors do have an impact. And I think the comparativists, again, as I said, I came to this leaning towards the comparativists, have a very strong case. This is not just, something unique, but there are mechanisms and there are factors that work within the PRC that you also see at work elsewhere. But what are the axes of variation then? Well, first of all, let's go back to that policy area. That different types of policy are more likely to fall in different groups depending on how they function. So if you have a very specific campaign with a very specific line of control that's very clear, let's say, and the PRC is good at certain things. I think it's pretty good at information campaigns, certain types of information campaigns. We could go into which ones work and which ones don't. But I think there's much more tighter, there's a much straighter line, when you're going from the center to certain elements of the propaganda system on the international stage, than if you're doing something like the BRI, which is this massive sprawling thing with all these different actors and people like a fellow of this China in the World program, Ye, has done excellent work, I think, in mapping some of this. That if you're doing something like the BRI, it's a much different story because of all the massive actors that you have to have involved, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you're doing something that's very specific and looking at something very specific where the lines of control are clear. I would say too, and I had an interesting interaction recently with somebody who involuntarily spent some time in certain parts of the Chinese security state. And he was saying that his interactions with them were very different. He had previously been someone, not unlike myself, who go to Beijing and interact with a certain group of people who study international relations and are very international and know the international relations theories and are quite cosmopolitan. Being placed in the security state put him in contact with people who didn't get out much because of their positions, actually probably didn't talk to many people internationally, even who had a very different worldview. And so our theories of universalism are in some ways based on the fact that people share certain basic assumptions as well. And if you have actors then who have assumptions that are very different about how the world works because of their placement in the system and their interaction or lack of interaction internationally, then you also get different types of behavior. Another issue is just time. And, the PRC state is constantly changing. It's something where, that line from Hegel about, the owl of Minerva flying after sunset, it feels like it's constantly true. The PRC is constantly changing itself, rearranging itself. The things that you studied, for example, about the organization of the various actors in the South China Sea 5 years ago or 10 years ago don't hold it. But also in the leadership. In terms of the leadership, we do have different leaders. Xi Jinping's, centralized way of approaching things is very different than Hu Jintao's more, how should I say, collective leadership or collective. I mean, you want to call it leadership. There's probably other words one could use for it, but it's very different. It does change. And when you look at one period, it may be that the things that you're looking at do fit into one of those, that it was more unified or less unified in one period, and it has become more unified in others. I think there's still debates to argue about how unified it really is right now, but still, you can't argue that things are changing. There is another part of time, which is what are you looking at? It's very interesting if you look at coming back to the BRI as an example, it's very interesting if you look at the evolution of scholarship on the BRI, because in the beginning there's the word, Xi Jinping says, let there be the BRI. And he says this, in two different places. And then they have, in 2015, they have the policy documents. And so you had this rush of scholarship to study the policy documents. To read the policy documents, they're extraordinarily logical. They're sort of extraordinarily reasoned. They make a lot of sense. And of course, the people who wrote on them says, oh, China has this grand plan to do all these things. And you have the corridors that are sort of mapped out there in that Xinhua map that they're going to build and all these other things. And so if you look at it that way, it looks like a very sort of centralized, clear strategic plan. Then you move to implementation. And implementation, as this Jonathan Hillman piece goes in 2018, the Belt and Road is full of holes. And you see that not just in Hillman's, you see that in others' work too. I think Minier makes that argument, Jan Drivey makes that argument. You see that in Zhang Jingen's work on slogan politics. You see it in a lot of different places. But then again, the PRC is still learning. And the PRC's, the PRC's never done something like this before. This is something new. It's going to make a lot of mistakes. But it does learn from those mistakes and it changes. And so depending on where you look in the policy process, you also will probably tell different stories and different things will apply. Now, coming to the last thing to say though, so what I'm advocating is that we treat these not as battles between assumptions, but rather as empirical statements that have differing degrees of validity depending on what, who, when you're looking at. And this is what Andrea and I are trying to argue in this piece. Now, the problem, of course, is the opacity of the PRC still. And so one of the parlor games, I was in Beijing in June. And one of the parlor games I sort of played was, can you explain to me why the COVID policy switched? And for every single person, I got a different story. And we can go into the Q&A, we can go into some of the stories or if you're interested. But it was everybody could sort of propose their stories. And somebody said to me, actually, it's fascinating because we don't know which of those stories are right. We have very little, you have varying degrees of people who you think are reliable, but you don't know which of those stories are right. And that's true for many things in the PRC. And we're seeing this repeatedly with these different people who disappear, and then you get these stories of why they disappear.
Can I just ask you a COVID question? Did the people with very different stories all state their opinion on what happened with confidence?
Varying degrees of confidence.
Oh, okay. Some people are not sure, but
some people were I think it was this. Other people were I talked to somebody.
Oh.
And so you get these different. Yes. No. Again, we can go into those when we go into the non-recorded Q&A. but it's a situation where you have opacity, and so it is in some ways very difficult in some cases to know which of these empirical claims are valid. And so the way in which I am thinking, at least at the moment where my thinking is, well, how do we deal with this? Well, 3 responses I would propose. First is probability and plausibility. And by probability and plausibility, I mean that it is very likely that something that involves massive amounts of actors is likely going to involve some form of domestic politics. It's very likely that something involves various bureaucratic agencies. Will probably, certain theories of bureaucratic politics will apply. So you can think probably that in these circumstances, you're probably going to be less unitary in your behavior than in circumstances where you have a clear line, a clear policy, a clear set of actors, clear understanding of what that policy should be, and enforcement mechanisms to make sure that those actors stay on target. The second is the alternative observable implications. And here we need to be really creative. Here we need to think about the dogs that bark and the dogs that don't bark, the various evidence, the various crumbs that may be left, to mix a whole bunch of metaphors, excuse me, in terms of when we think about the way in which policy is formulated. If this theory is true, what else should be true? If this theory is true, not just what should we see, what shouldn't we see, when should we see it? What should we see as other possible outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And so really thinking, it's detective work. It really is sort of a detective work. And the third thing I would say is humility. I think we just need to be very honest. And this is something that really worries me, to be honest with you, is that I think sometimes people say with a lot of confidence that this was because of X or this was because of Y. And I think we need to actually have a bit of humility in terms of here are the various plausible explanations for this. And at this point, we cannot determine. From past experience, we would think this. And so this may be more probable that past experiences has been done this way, or these actors have been involved, and therefore it would probably be like this. But I do think we do need a bit of humility going into this, even though that's probably not those don't give you the answers that policymakers necessarily like. But then again, this is about scholarship. So I think with that, I've come to an end. Thank you very much.